We're live. Welcome, friends from around the world. I'm in the middle of a little kombucha explosion. That's how we're going to start this episode. I was going to say I wanted this episode to be sponsored by Hatha Kombucha, an awesome kombucha company here in Israel. They didn't give me any money, but I like their product, so I was going to shout them out, but then they exploded everywhere. This is kiwi lime kombucha. You can find them on Instagram. It seems to be the yellow kiwi. That's new and it's in. And for those who don't know what kombucha is, it's fermented tea. It's high in probiotics, supposedly healthy. But why the hell are we talking about kombucha? This is the Great Debate. We're here to have a vibrant conversation. Welcome, everybody. For those who are here for the first time, what is the Great Debate? It's not a debate where two sides work to defeat one another. That's not what we're here to do. Mohammad and Daniel are not going to fight. They may disagree, but the goal of the Great Debate is to come together and find common ground on the most important issues we face. That's what makes this debate great. We're looking for a deep, nuanced conversation on important issues. And that's what you'll see here. So welcome, everybody. Without further ado, I'm very excited to announce our guests. On my bottom left, we have Daniel Brooks, who is the founder and current board member of 3GNY, a nonprofit organization from the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, whose mission is to educate the public on their family stories and lessons of the Holocaust. As an Israel advocate, he has organized demonstrations, spoken on panels, and written op-eds in the Times of Israel. Daniel is currently Associate Director of Fuel for Truth and an educator with Club Z, both nonprofit organizations dedicated to Israel education. On my bottom right, Mohammad Faraj is a Palestinian American that has lived both in Palestine and New York. He is currently a graduate student at Brooklyn College for bilingual childhood education. He dedicates his free time discussing various topics, including the Palestine-Israeli conflict and advocating for human solutions to the conflict. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure.
So, it's interesting. The guests generally send in their bio. Sorry, I still have this exploded kombucha here. I'm trying to take a sip. But Mohammad, you sent in your bio to me, and it says Palestine-Israel conflict, and I've never called it that before. I just read it off as Palestine and Israel conflict, and it was super counterintuitive because my whole life I've known it as the Israel-Palestine conflict. So it's interesting how which side of the border you were born on or what your side is. It's kind of how you frame the conflict. So it's an interesting observation that I just experienced firsthand. Before we get started on the topics, I'd like to just give you both a few minutes to explain what your connection to the land of Israel and Palestine is. Whoever wants to start, the floor is yours.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Great, thanks, Mohammed. So I grew up in New York City. I'm Jewish. Not Israeli. Grew up the grandson of 4 Holocaust survivors, and as you mentioned, Adar, I founded that organization 15 years ago, third generation New York. Growing up, the connections I felt to Israel were primarily a couple things. It was my Israeli cousins who'd sometimes visit New York. I have aunts, uncles, other cousins who are Israeli, who live in Israel. A few of them actually just made Aliyah. And my mother, who was a marketing executive for an Israeli bank, Bank Hapoalim in New York. When I was growing up. So I was actually ensconced in like Israel marketing materials here and there. So I did get this generic kind of pro-Israel understanding without really fully knowing what it was. I first visited Israel on an organized trip in 1993. This was before birthright, so the parents had to pay up. I've been there 4 times since. And as I mentioned, I grew up sort of understanding Israel in a generic sense, but it was really in 2001, during the second Intifada, that I committed to educating myself more. I remember just reading coverage of what was going on, the bombings, Israel's military responses, and I recall feeling that it was unfair, and without really knowing exactly why. There might have been some moments where I was like, oh, that I know that to be not true, but I was embarrassed that I didn't really know why, yet I felt it was unfair. And so I was like, that's not acceptable. I really have to learn the issue. Otherwise, why am I getting emotionally invested in this topic? So I just committed myself. That was almost 20 years ago to knowing the history, knowing the people as best I can. I don't speak to many Palestinians. In fact, it's pretty rare. So I'm really humbled to be here talking to Mohammad. And I've just committed myself to knowing more about the issue, knowing more about the history, defending the truth, pushing back against the hate, and ultimately creating productive channels for conversation and resolution. So thanks again for having me.
Awesome. Great to have you, Daniel. Mohammad, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. So my connection to the land basically started with the fact that I was born there. I was born in Jerusalem, but moved to New York. Me and my parents moved to New York when I was super young, before I even became a year old. And I stayed there until I went to a Islamic school here in New York until I was in 3rd grade. And then they were worried that I was going to get too Americanized and kind of forget about the culture and stuff. So they brought me back to Palestine, to Ramallah specifically, where I lived until my senior year of high school. I graduated my high school over there and moved back to New York. And now I go back almost every summer, except for this summer, obviously. But I go back every summer for about a month or a month and a half at a time to go visit. And so, for the most part, similarly, I grew up in a pretty pro-Palestinian generic household, but it wasn't my parents weren't really that political, but I still had, we were still taught in school, being very patriotic and stuff. And at that point, I've never met, the only Israelis I've ever met were soldiers or settlers that you would see when going on a highway from one city to the other. And so I didn't really have any opinion of, I just knew that Israel bad, and that was about it. And when I moved to New York, and especially Brooklyn and Queens, I can imagine it's very diverse. You meet a whole bunch of different people. In undergrad, you get to meet more people and stuff. Since then, I began to try to my best to look at the whole situation from a third-person perspective, and try to be more objective when analyzing what's happening, and trying to look at it from a more of a humanitarian issue as opposed to an ethnic conflict. So since then, I've been trying to my opinions change pretty frequently depending on what we're specifically talking about at the moment. But I'm just always hoping to learn and engage more with people that have different opinions, so I can formulate a better opinion myself.
Awesome. It's great to have you here too, Mohammad. So before we get started, I just wanted to mention that to all our guests from around the world, welcome. Maybe let us know in the chat where you're from, and let's engage in a vibrant dialogue in the chat as well. Also, feel free to ask questions. We will get to the questions towards the end. And if you like what our guests are saying, you can find their contact information in the event description. Feel free to reach out to them. They're always happy to engage in dialogue after the fact. We also have a little after party in our Discord server. For those who are unfamiliar with Discord, it's just another messaging app, but really for gamers. So we have a private chat there that's for Patreon members and for guest speakers. If you haven't already, check out the Patreon. It's link in the description. You can unlock all sorts of cool benefits and tiers by supporting this channel on Patreon. And even if you don't want to support Patreon, that's fine. Give us an upvote on this video, subscribe, or even downvote if you don't like it. We're cool with that too. Just express yourself. That's what we want. We just want expression. So, Mo, you in our Discord chat earlier, you brought up an interesting point about Zionism, and I think this is a good place to start the conversation. You want to share what the question was?
Yeah, sure. So I was interested in the fact of how Zionism changed in the modern context as opposed to how it started in the minds of Menachem Weizmann and Theodore Herzl and that sort of thing, and how it basically gradually shifted from being a more secular movement to a religious movement as it is in its current manifestation. And so I was curious to see what you guys, either of you, thought about that, and if we've reached similar analytical conclusions on on this sort of shift.
Sure. Yeah, Daniel, you wanna start?
Sure. So at its heart, Zionism, always political Zionism, the movement to establish, has been the movement to establish and maintain a Jewish state in the land of Israel, or at least in a part of the land of Israel. And while there have been some movements towards religious Zionism in the last several decades, I mean, ultimately, that's still how most Jews and most Zionists define Zionism. That's still effectively what Israel is. Israel is still a collective. It's a Jewish collective. So, we might have policies that may be influenced by those on the right, those on the religious right in Israel, more so now than perhaps before. But ultimately, it's still that same basic definition, which I think also, we'll get to this, but I think it's still the heart of the conflict, which is just, denying that right for a Jewish collective, you could say, or Jewish society, to put it a little more succinctly.
Yeah, well said. And just to build on that, it's true that in its initial days, Zionism was secular, but that's because it was, still quite a small movement. Now, it's not that it's become religious, it's that there is also religious Zionism. So, if you, around 50% of the Jews living in Israel are observant Jews, the other 50% are secular. And, there's a spectrum of what it means to be observant or secular, but regardless of who you ask, the secular or observant, the majority of them would identify as Zionists. So it's not that Zionism has moved from being secular to religious, it's now also religious. And I think that the religious Zionism might cause more waves because it's generally, we hear about the settlers and their ideology, and there's a lot of focus on religious Zionism because they're essentially more directly connected to the conflict because of where they're living. So I think maybe that's why there's a perception that religious Zionism is the Zionism today. I just think it's most Jews are Zionists, some are secular, some are Israeli. Something to add to that, I think the term Zionism also creates a lot of confusion, because if you ask somebody who's pro-Israel what Zionism means, they'd say it's just the right to self-determination on our ancestral homeland. That's essentially what it is, with some small variations. But if you ask somebody who opposes Israel what Zionism is, they would tell you it's akin to Jewish supremacy. It's people who hate Palestinians and commit genocide. And what I'm going to tell people who have this version of Zionism, if you have any interest in engaging in dialogue with Israelis, then you should use the definition that they use, because this is their own personal identity. And if you want to be able to communicate with them, you should, you shouldn't take what they view as an essential part of their identity and turn it into something that's as horrible as supremacy or even Nazism, which it's often compared to. So that's just a little pointer for how to have better dialogue between pro and anti-Israel people. It's to agree on what Zionism means.
Yeah, before I get to what
Sure.
I add to that, I just wanted to add briefly to that. I mean, I think just because it doesn't help that the word Zion is not really understood, and people don't really know what it connects to. And obviously it connects to the land, but at its origin, Zion referred to, a hill in Jerusalem, a fortress. And I think, my Jewish education growing up did not provide that knowledge to me. So, if you would have asked me when I was a young adult, my 20s, what's Zionism? I could have told you very basically, but if you said, well, what does it mean? Like, and the etymology of it, I couldn't tell you. And so I think that's also a barrier to understanding it. It just seems like an odd term. And anytime you have an ism there, I think it has a negative connotation.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because do we even need the term Zionism? Can't we just say that we're Jewish and we believe we have the right to homeland? Like what?
That's what I was gonna say. I feel like it's very difficult. I don't even think it's very difficult. I think it's downright impossible to ever convince most Palestinians that Zionism is somehow anyway could be translated into a good thing. And that's just literally, that's from my experience. I've been surrounded by Palestinians my whole life, and for the most part, I just think that's what it is. And the thing is, with really what the sticking point about Zionism that's really upsetting for Palestinians and for a lot of people around the world is that it excludes half the population of the land as part of being that state by creating a quote unquote Jewish state or a homeland for Jews. It basically excludes half the population, basically tells Arab Israelis or Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza that you guys, this is not a state for you guys. This is a state for only us. And so that's really the thing and it most likely stems from the fact that Zionism came from a past where nationalism was on the rise and where like a lot of like colonialization was happening. And so like I can see like how that originated, but I just feel like moving forward, it probably needs to change for the most part. Yeah.
There's something I wrote down that you said that's just grabbing me, and it's so basic. It's the idea, the framing of in the land, where you were saying that Palestinians see it, Zionism as a state for just us guys, and not for us in the land, or you might have said in the whole land. But it's understood that Palestinians see the whole land as theirs, or at least to a large extent. And I think a lot of Zionists don't see it that way. I mean, they might conversely see Israel as the entirety of the land, but the way I see it is there is a division, and to me, there's nothing completely politically sacred about between river and the land between the river and the sea. And some Zionists, and I think rightly so, have pointed out that the exact borders of river to the sea Palestine was actually a very brief period of history, for a couple of decades under the British Mandate. Not to say that Palestinians weren't living, or Arabs, of that origin weren't living in different parts, but there was also the East Bank of the Jordan, and that was considered historic Palestine as well, by various people. So I just, it's an interesting framework to talk about, in the land, quote unquote, because different people have different interpretations of what that means.
All right.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So what do you think needs to be done? What can we do to move forward? Right, we're obviously having this conversation, but Mohammad, as you mentioned, most Palestinians will not accept the term Zionism, and I'm sure many cringe even at the term Israel, because I know from firsthand experience that me just saying the word Palestine is triggering to many Israelis, right? So this
Right.
is the result of a century of conflict and a lot of trauma, a lot of pain and trauma, which causes many of our people to be triggered by these terms. So what can we do to make maybe even not necessarily these terms more acceptable, but just being able to bring both people together towards common ground? What do you see as good first steps to making that happen?
I would say, like, from my perspective, I feel since the Israeli government has the upper hand and pretty much has most control of all the situation that's going on in the West Bank and inside 48 or Israel. I feel like it's their duty and almost obligation, since really like everything that Palestinians do is at the mercy of Israel. We can't drive from city to city without going through checkpoints, or we can't really in the end of the day, like the PA is just basically a puppet government controlled with various levels of influence from Israel. And that's the reason why we're allowed to have this level of minor autonomy. But I think for the biggest thing is that the Israeli government needs to make a concerted effort to try to bring Palestinians into the fold and say that this country belongs to you, and we understand that the mistake that we did in the past, like for example, like America, like right now you see America is going through this sort of reawakening of saying that, oh, the founding of the Americas wasn't as glorious as it seemed. There's a lot of indigenous people that got killed throughout the process. There was slavery involved. There was a lot of this abuse of minority groups. And then after that, America has came to the great, for better or worse, most Americans have come to the realization that what happened in the past is a mistake. And that's why we have these movements and these laws that are enacted to acknowledge the past of America. I feel like Israel needs to do the exact same thing, that regardless, like we know the creation, the way that the state was created had a lot of immorality in it and a lot of suffering and a lot of pain. But we are here now, and we got to find a way to look forward and try to live put ourselves in a situation where we live peacefully with our neighbors and see each other as brethren as opposed to enemies.
So you're under the opinion that because Israel has most of the power, that the onus is really on us to do most of the work in reconciliation?
Yeah, I feel, yeah, I do that. It's not that Palestinians just got to sit there and like just wait until like Israel comes and apologizes to them. It's just that the way that like this probably goes into our conversation about the power dynamics is that Israel, for the most part, has all the leverage in the situation. Like as you saw, like they basically made up the peace deal with Bahrain and what was the other? Oh yeah, the UAE, about like, you know, normalizing between
Right.
Arabs and Jews. And the thing was that it's like they completely like forgot about like Palestinians. This whole like problem and all this conflict between the Arab world and Israel came from is from the Palestinians. Is that like the Palestinians were the ones that were undergoing through the trauma. The UAE and Bahrain have never been engaged in any like direct physical conflict with Israel. Maybe like during the oil years where they like, you know, all the Gulf countries like cut oil to the US, that had like some effect, but for the most part they were like relatively like peaceful already. This I just seemed like nonsense to me, that and avoiding of like the real problem of how do we address the problems that Palestinians face and how can we fix that.
Okay, Daniel, where do you stand on the issue of and you know, this kind of goes into a topic that you proposed about power dynamics, right? So where do you stand on that? Who's the onus on? How do we reconcile? What's the way forward?
Sure. A lot to unpack there, but I'll start with the power dynamics. I do think it is a very unfortunate myth that because Israel holds greater military and greater economic power over the Palestinians, that the onus is on them to solve this conflict. A few reasons. One, Israelis have had 25 years of making concerted, very publicized efforts of solving the conflict. Now, we can disagree on the specifics of those efforts. At the same time, these have been very public, and Israelis have elected 2 prime ministers who ran on specific peace platforms. So it's very much on record that Israelis tried this and it backfired. And I know it's it's kind of inconvenient to talk about the PA's activities for the last 25 years, but you know, we don't have to go through a whole timeline. But you know, when the PA was created, they wasted no time to use all their media to incite against Israel and essentially to tell their people that Oslo was a ruse. And you know, we could play around with the timeline and say, well, settlements increased, or maybe the Israeli military did X, Y, Z. But there's really nothing that trumps, you know, the so-called peace partner of the Palestinian Authority, you know, broadcasting very clearly that they have no intention of ever recognizing Israel or a 2-state solution. So that's one thing. But I want to talk about the power because I'm just curious. What do you think, Mohammad, that the Palestinian society has any power, and if so, what levers of power do they have?
They probably have soft power and like influence in trying to influence each other, but in terms of economics or the basic things that are needed to sustain human life, such as electricity, water, agriculture, that's almost all controlled by Israel. And so that's what leads me to like put most of the onus on the Israeli government, since they do have almost most of the cards in their hand. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that specifically the Palestinians have 2 types of power that are often overlooked: diplomatic power and media power. I think media power may be bigger than diplomatic, but I think they work hand in hand. Now we could argue that maybe the diplomatic power took a hit for this, you know, the latest UAE deal, Bahrain. I would say that whole, you know, the way you said they were left out, they were completely forgotten about, which, you know, not entirely. I mean, I don't want to get into all the specifics of this Trump deal, but they were invited. But even before that, in 2014, you know, the PA explicitly said we will never again directly negotiate with Israel, and so that's very relevant. I mean, it didn't even need to hear that announcement. They, for decades, are telegraphing that they are going to try to hold out politically and not sign any agreement with Israel. So I get that Israel has power on the ground, but the reason that the military occupation of certain parts of the West Bank have perpetuated is because they can't hand over this land and this infrastructure to moderate Palestinians such as yourself, right? They need You need a political entity. And I think that's often overlooked, that we are dealing with people, but really at the end of the day, what affects people? It's their leadership, right? It's politics, it's power. So, I mean, I have heard from Palestinians who are moderate and want to make peace with Israel. And when I was in Israel, I spoke to several, and I was heartwarmed. At the same time, I realized that there needs to be, and this is where the onus, this is where the responsibility comes in. Because you were saying that, you were kind of tying this to the civil rights movement now, this big moment. And actually, I agree to a large extent, but I think I see it the other way. Israel has already had these conversations about their origins, some of the things that happened in the 48 war, right? The racism that goes on in Israeli society, like it does in any society. I'm not to say that those conversations should be over. I mean, they're always ongoing. But I don't think there's been any equivalent conversation in Palestinian society. I think it's actually shockingly mute. I think that people are intimidated from engaging on these issues, as we've seen evidence of people who want to engage with Israel and they're intimidated. So I think that's a real problem. And I think that it's not going to be overnight, but ultimately the Palestinians have to start a dialogue, an internal dialogue. From what I've seen, that hasn't happened. And I think that, like we're reconciling our past as Americans. I think Israelis have already done that to a large extent. You've had the new historians. You've had, Israeli media, as you know, is very tenacious. These conversations are always going on. I think Palestinians have a lot of people who do want to have these conversations, and they're literary. I think they're in the media. They have a lot of media channels, and this needs to happen because that's going to be what drives the politics. That national conversation. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, the conversation that Palestinians need to have.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part again?
I'd like to hear your thoughts on the need for Palestinians as a collective to have this conversation, meaning what do they want? What do we want as a collective? And do we need to defeat the radicals and extremists in our midst?
Right.
Mohammad,
go ahead, Adar.
Before you go, Daniel, I think it's great points. I'd love to hear Mohammed's thoughts. I just want to make a quick comment. Chat. Take a deep breath. It's okay. Learn from Daniel and Mohammad what productive dialogue is all about. There's no reason to be hating one another. Just know that you will never convince an Israeli, or an Israeli will never convince a Palestinian to change their mind if you're acting hateful towards them, and if you're delegitimizing them and not even recognizing the right to exist. So again, breathe. We could do better, guys. We can do better. And Mohammad, I'll give it to you. I want to add something to what Daniel said that, I think kind of sums it up. So, it seems obvious that those with the most power have the most responsibility to make change. And there's a lot of truth to that. But when an Israeli hears that, their natural reaction is to say, but all the Palestinians need to do for there to be peace is allow us to live, is just accept us here. But if we want peace, the process to attain that is so complex, we don't even know what to do, which borders, there's just, like the process for Israelis to take control and get to peace is so challenging. And then most Israelis say all Palestinians need to do is accept us living here, and that's fine. Now, I understand that's easier said than done, because after years of humiliation and oppression and losing more and more land, to just say accept it, especially with that Middle Eastern pride and honor, right? It's not a realistic explanation, but this is how many Israelis see it. So it's like, how can we respond to that? So, that's just some food for thought. I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts.
So that's the thing. Like, for example, like it was mentioned before, that Palestinians vary in their opinions of what it is and how the conflict is and what should happen and stuff like that. But the thing is, like, for example, me, I don't come from a family of refugees. I come from a city, from a small town adjacent to Ramallah that maintained most of its land, only got some land confiscated for the settlement of Beit El near Ramallah. But for the most part, we kept most of our property. I find it hard for myself, in a straight face, like, go to a person, that a refugee that came from Yafa and families ended up in Gaza, going to them like, listen, man, like, this would just be over if you just learn to accept it. Like, whatever, your grandpa lost their house. It is what it is. What are you going to do? Like, I at least it's a bad taste in my mouth for me to tell you, like, yo, guys, just chill out, while I have the luxury of, like, living in my city, going back to visit, not worrying about any like anything crazy happening over there. And so that's something it's very difficult. Like it's very difficult for me to address. If that makes sense, yeah.
I hear you. Yeah, and now maybe if you want to address what Daniel asked about, what conversations need to be had amongst Palestinians to.
I feel like for the most part, Palestinians are still carrying on that the trauma of their parents or grandparents of like what happened to them. A lot of them still live in exile in either in America or they live in the West Bank. Like for the most part, like Ramallah right now houses the most, I feel like, most refugees out of any other city, any other Palestinian city. And so outside of in the West Bank, outside of Gaza probably has a lot more refugees over there. But I feel like the conversation that's needed to be had is, this is how I look at it from my perspective. I look at things from a humanitarian perspective, and it might be a little biased, but like I say, what is the path that could lead to less people dying and less people suffering, for the most part, and being able to like enjoy their life for the most part, without having to fear for their lives. And I think for Palestinians, that conversation first needs to happen in terms of identity and what are we willing to compromise on in order to make peace. And I'm only one person. I don't represent the majority of Palestinians. So it's a very tough question to answer. But I believe the first part of this is to realize that a lot of people that live in Israel right now were born there. They didn't immigrate anytime recently. This is the only place that they know, and just like we didn't have a choice in being born to this conflict, they didn't have either for the most part. And so we're just gonna need to learn how to realize how like this land is for both of us without causing such hate and animosity between us. And so it's a very tough question, but that's like my go at it.
I in the chat earlier, thank you, Mohammad, told you guys that I wanted to ask a similar question because we started off defining Zionism. And I wanted to ask you, Mohammad, how do you define the Palestinian cause? I know that could be a loaded term, but the Free Palestine movement, it's taken on different forms, but in my eyes, and I think in the eyes of a lot of Israel supporters, it's maintained the same stance, that it is against, a Jewish state, and I don't think there's ever been, again, I don't want to do a whole Oslo review, but I don't think there's ever been a real, good faith effort to get to a two-state solution. I'm not saying that all or even most Palestinians ever wanted that. I just want to understand, the movers and shakers on the ground, the guys, the activists, the academics, the politicians, how would you define the Palestinian cause as they forward it? And where do you think it's going? Do you think it is moderating? And I think, I want to hear that first, because I kind of got the sense that you were alluding to the fact that there should not be a Jewish state, at least the way it exists today. So look into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know Adar had hosted this conversation many times before. And I think the idea of having a state based on a specific identity, and I know I've heard other points, is like, oh, what's wrong with having one Jewish state when there's all these other Arab states and stuff like that. But the thing is, I feel like the difference is that like Israel became a Jewish state by force, and whether the people that lived on the land liked it or not. And so the idea of like having a state be imposed on the indigenous population seems very troubling to me. I don't know, it just doesn't sit well with me. And I'm trying to look at this from like a third person perspective. I feel like if a state does exist, it could be a homeland for the Jews, but as well as for Palestinians. I don't feel like one ethnic group has a leg up over what they get to, like how they define the state. I feel like the state should be defined by everyone that lives there, and not just one ethnic group. And so I understand like all the traumas that happened that was all the things that happened in Europe that caused the reason for the creation of a Jewish state. I can understand that, and all the anti-Semitism that was plaguing Europe and such. But right now, I just feel like the answer to it is not to make an island out of the old homes of a bunch of refugees and say like, this is a Jewish state, we're gonna do our own thing here, and like, if you like anyone else that lives over here, sure, you're citizens of Israel, but like, first and foremost, the state is here to serve me, the Jewish citizen of the state. So yeah, that's from my opinion, I guess.
Thanks for sharing. Can I just follow up on something you just said about Israel becoming a Jewish state by force?
Sure.
You feel the birth of Israel needed to come about through force, or it was forced upon the Jewish community?
I feel like during the creation of the state of Israel, Zionists were having mixed opinions among like the Jewish people that lived in Eastern Europe or Western Europe at the time. And so the thing is that like I'm sorry, can you like ask the second?
Said, Israel becoming a Jewish state by force. It's
right.
Whether people on the land liked it or not. And I know it that kind of line is said very breezily often. Like, it's just sort of assumed that Israel was birthed through force. And of course, there's truth in that. There was a war, but I think the problem with that that implication is that Israel, or Zionism generally, that violence necessitated its birth. Like, it needed to uproot, it needed to, dislocate. Palestinians needed to be dislocated for the birth of a Jewish state. And most Zionists take a very different view. Is that a Jewish society was developing and getting bigger. And of course, there was political opposition from the Arabs, and even just, on an individual level, there was opposition. But there was also there were also Palestinian Arabs who worked with the Jewish Zionists and wanted to be a part of this society, or who said, you know what, we're going to be separated at some point in the future, but I'm going to do business with this guy, this company or whatever. And there were Arabs who did benefit. And, of course, they were undercut by their radical brethren. And so I think there's a different view that a lot of Israelis say this was not inevitable. Palestinian dislocation did not have to happen. And
right, but
that's ultimately a product of call it anti-Zionism, call it the war against Israel, but that happened before 48. I mean, that happened in the 1920s when you had...
Right. But here, like, from my understanding is that Palestinians before everything, like, for the most part, were very apolitical. People didn't really think about much about, like, terms of politics or nationality and stuff. And the thing was that a lot of the early Zionist settlers that moved to Palestine grew up in this sort of nationalistic fervor that was happening all over Europe. And so they decided to, like, they got caught up in this, like, sort of nationalism and decided to immigrate to, at the time, mandatory Palestine. And so the thing the thing is that many like from the different strains of Zionism that were going around, a lot of the early Zionists wanted to secure support from like the big players in the Middle East at the time, which were Britain and France, in order to have this Jewish state in the land of Palestine. And then other people like the people like I mentioned earlier, like Menachem Weizmann, who said that, like, listen, we don't need their help. We can just go settle in the land and we'll just be a reality. We'll just build stuff, and then, like, they can't just take us out. And while they're having this discussion about, like, creating the state of Israel, no one gave a crap, like, about what the Palestinians who were, like, living at the time thought. And so it's like Palestinians were just like, whatever, like, it is what it is. It's happening. And then after that, when they felt like, when the Palestinians that were living in 48, like the previous things that happened before the Nakba, they started getting worried, saying, oh, like, a lot of these new settlers are buying land and kicking some people out and sort of thing. And, like, it got them on edge, I believe, to be, like, with, like, good intentions. And then after that, it just ended up in this sort of, like, struggle that ended up, like, carrying on till this day. But yeah, that's, like, it's on. Yeah, people say, like, it didn't have to be like this. Like, listen, if they just, like, accepted us as, like, the new caretakers of the land, it's just like, yeah, it would have been all cool and stuff. But, like, it's not, like, people don't, like, give up that easily. People aren't just going to, like, I think it's part of human nature. People aren't just going to be like, oh yeah, like, yeah, sure, come in, you become our new overlords. Thank you, Ottomans. Thank you, British. let the new landlords come in. It's not going to be that easy. And a lot of like bad things happen. A lot of like Palestinians did some like messed up stuff to us, right? To Israelis, and that's obviously has happened. But like at the same time, like it all stems from this sort of like deep nationalistic fervor of trying to create a one ethnicity state. But yeah, go ahead. You have something else to say?
Let me just let me just bring something up, because I see people in the comments I don't know, we have like a very basic platitude comment section today. A lot of things that, just with a little bit of logic and compassion, you could debunk. There's a common claim that the original Zionists did nothing wrong because they bought the land from Ottoman landowners, and this was before 48. They bought land from Ottoman landowners. There were Palestinians living on that land, and many of them were kicked off that land, and that's somehow legitimate because they bought it from the Ottoman landowners. Guys, we're not looking at like complex legal philosophy. That's not what this is about. Just because something is technically legal at a certain time does not mean it's moral. And don't expect the population that's living on a land for many generations to be okay with being kicked off because one wealthy person made a deal with another wealthy person. Like, come on. You wouldn't accept that if that was done to your family. So don't hold Palestinians to double standard. That is an injustice that Israelis need to recognize. Saying, oh, but we bought it from Ottoman landowners. No, you're not convincing anybody. That's literally an echo chamber claim that does nothing to progress change. Not a single Palestinian in the history of Palestinians existing have been convinced by that argument. So just drop it. It's useless.
To that point, that's actually something, sorry to interrupt, that's something I looked into many years ago when I first got into this. The story of the Fayyin, right? The Arab farmers.
Yeah.
And there that really wasn't done in the context of like, let's say, conflict or war, right? That was like early on. I don't know the exact number. I think it was in the low thousands, but still, these are people, and that has a place in the story, in the narrative, right? These are people who were, lost their employment, lost their livelihoods, right? And that does affect the society. And I think, we could always offer a perspective, thing like, oh, well, after that, then the Arab politics ruined everything, But I mean, I think that's true too. At the same time, I agree with you. You have to acknowledge the humanity of people and the political decisions that affect their lives. And that's the point I was making earlier about the hardships that Arabs and the Palestinian Arabs have to go through. Is that it is a product of politics. It's not in a vacuum that just all of a sudden their lives are harder because Israel decides to make them harder. But I just wanted to respond to a couple things before we move on.
Sure. Yeah.
So, and again, we're not doing a history lesson, but you had mentioned that early Zionists, you paraphrase them as essentially saying we don't care about the Palestinians. And, I can't speak for every Zionist pioneer, but there is a large record of early Zionist thinkers and activists who did reach out to Palestinian Arab notables, leaders, community leaders. There was a lot of cooperation going on the ground. That is sort of like I would say an understated part of history, or like an unknown part of history. After the British came in, even before the British, but especially after, during the Mandate years, that Zionist leaders took it upon themselves to do outreach to the Arab leaders in Palestine. So I wouldn't just simply say, they didn't care about the Palestinians. I would say they thought a lot about the Palestinians. And often when there was meetings with Palestinians, they really wouldn't go anywhere. They wouldn't go too far on a political level. There was some economic cooperation, but I think that's just important to point out, because that's another throwaway line you sort of hear, that the Zionists, the Jews, didn't really think about the Arabs there, which is really it's a myth. But I wanted to get to the point about you're talking about a society, the Jewish society there, that's sort of geared for their own people, right? Like in that scene, how can an Arab accept that? I can understand how, the development of that Jewish society was very unique, right? Because it did happen over the course of a few decades, really. And that, in the annals of history, that is a unique story. Of course, the Jewish story is a unique story. But
yes.
We also have, I think what gets overlooked also is that the Arabs in that land also have a society. And it's been shaped by Zionism to a large extent in terms of providing an ethos for them, like sort of a collective ethos. But I would say that that's really the ultimate response I have for the argument that Israel is all about, the Jews and housing the Jews. I mean, look at Palestinians today. It's a society that is very, there are disagreements, but at the same time, there is a lot of pride, a lot of collective pride in their history, right?
Right.
They know how to rock the keffiyeh, they know how to sing their anthem, maybe not all of them. They wave the flag, they have their own distinct culture. Not to say that they don't want to go to Israel and hang out in Israel, or they don't feel tied to Israeli land. At the same time, the bottom line is these are two separate societies that wish to remain separate. I guess, there could be pushback on that. Like, why am I projecting my views onto Palestinians? But it just seems based on a lot of empirical evidence, putting aside surveys, because I some surveys are flawed, but based on the activities on the ground, these are two societies that are not interested in mixing and deleting themselves. So I think that sort of ultimately is where we have to go forward. We have to acknowledge that it's not just individual Arabs we shouldn't expect them to lead. We shouldn't expect these societies to go anywhere.
Right. No, I understand what you're saying. And that probably opens the door to a next conversation. So knowing that we talked a little bit about the past, what does the future look like now? How do we address what's happening now, what happened in the past, and how do we change it into something that's for the better in the future, if that makes sense. So I don't know how you envision a future, if you want a 2-state, a 1-state, maybe 3 states. I don't know, Jerusalem by itself or something. But maybe if you can share your opinion on that, you can go ahead.
Great. Yeah, it's a central question. I do think it's funny because I think in a chat earlier in the week you had framed something that kind of caught my mind. You had said something like, "What would a future state look like?" Mm-hmm. And I was a little triggered by that because it's kind of well, why a future state? We already have is he suggesting Israel would not exist anymore? And we could get into all this discussion about how do you change the structures of Israel to please whatever, let's say, the Palestinian cause wants. But I think my bottom line is, just to be more direct with the answer, is that any solution has to involve this Jewish society existing, and that Jewish society existing needs to be able to defend itself. Again, we don't have to get into all the details, what the borders have to be, what the power balance has to be, but ultimately, any sort of collective like that, wants to, just like the Palestinians, they want to maintain their language in their schools, their own history, right, their own court system, their own police. Not to say that Palestinians are all anti-Jewish or they don't want Jews around them, but at the same time, I think that goes for both sides, right? They kind of like their own stuff. So it has to start with that premise. We could always talk about borders or other specifics. I do think that we often get caught up with that map, and the map is key, right? Because it's reality. You see look how much land Israel has and look how little land the Palestinian Arabs have. Let's say if poof, we had some negotiations tomorrow and there was a Palestinian state, it would look like it was dwarfed by Israel, right? And
yeah.
I think some of that is a bit of a lack of imagination because, and I'm going to mention Jordan, and often that gets eye rolls from people who are oh, that's a right-wing Likud sort of Jordan is Palestine thing. But I think what it speaks to is that the reason Jordan has always been, I'm not saying the entirety of Jordan, but if you just look at the map and you slice off a fifth of Western Jordan, and I'm just using this as an example, I'm not promoting this as an idea, and you add that to, and this you connect parts of the West Bank to that Arab state, that Palestinian state, that's a pretty big state. And it looks like it's pretty much the same size as Israel. So if we're getting to the point where we need to instill a sense of dignity and honor to the Palestinian collective by having equal things, that could be a possible solution. It's they want more land. Okay, Jordan is 80% a Palestinian Arab now. I don't know why they're completely eliminated from the discussion. So that's one thing. But anyway, I just wanted to get back to your point. I do think that any solution just has to acknowledge reality. And the reality is that you have these two societies that don't want to mix, hence the absurdity of the apartheid comparison, because no matter how long Israel controls the territories, that's not going to make it apartheid. It's not going to undo Israel's Jewish character, because ultimately You have it's a two-state reality on the ground. I know people might be like, what is he saying? You have Israel controlling everything, but it really is a two-entity reality. So I want to hear your thoughts on that and how you see that.
I was thinking like maybe you can convince a couple of people that saying like, oh, maybe we just chop off a slice of Jordan from this side over here, and we got 2 equal size land, equal population, everyone lives happily ever after. But I feel like the most important issue is like for a lot of Palestinians, especially in diaspora, is the refugees and like how are they gonna? They don't want to go back to Madaba or Irbid in Jordan. They want to go to Majd al-Shams, or they want to go to Jaffa, they want to go to Akka, they want to go to all these like cities that are part of right now Israel proper. And so like, do they just like, tough luck for you, dude? You got to go to you got to go to Jordan now, or like, or what?
Go to Jordan. This is saying, if land and the development of land is an issue, right? Because we hear about Gaza not having a lot of land and all that, and you want an economically viable state. There could be creative solutions, but I want to address the thing with the refugees. And I know I spoke longer than you, but I'll get back.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think the refugees is an important subject, but I think it's been so politicized that, that's why I have a hard time taking seriously the notion that the Palestinian cause, or call it the Free Palestine movement, has at its core humanitarian concerns. I'm not saying that. I mean, I think it's more political. And I think the political positions, for instance, like right of return, it does speak to a humanitarian intent and like a sentiment. But when you have, little Palestinian children growing up in refugee camps, many of whom, I would say it's a large minority, many of whom are already in the land of historic Palestine, right? Which is what Palestinians would call Palestine. They're growing up in West Bank, in refugee camps. That's unacceptable. And I think that's part of the problem. I think, they're not all scattered to the four winds. Many of them are living in the land of their families and ancestors. Can they go back to the same house? I mean, I think it's hard to unwind history and unwind the genocidal war that was thrust upon the Jewish community at the time. And I understand from a personal family level the pain. Like, I think that's important to understand. But I think we can't overlook the political dynamic of this. And that if you do try to put this right of return in place, I don't think that's a humanitarian response. I think it's actually going to lead to more bloodshed.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that. I think that we often hear about a two-state solution being the solution. The European Union seems to support it. The United States supports it. The rest of the Arab world supports it. But it seems like people here on the ground are more and more looking at some kind of a one-state solution. Now, one state scares many Israelis for demographic reasons, but there's more sophisticated solutions that people are coming up with, and the general idea is that all Israelis and all Palestinians will have access to the entire land. Palestinians can go to Jerusalem, they could go to Tel Aviv, they could visit all parts of Israel. Israelis can visit all parts of Palestine. Now, also, what will it be called? I even see it as less important, right? In Israel, an Israeli could stand in Ramallah and say, "I'm in Israel," and a Palestinian could stand in Tel Aviv and say, "This is Palestine." I think we need to change our way of viewing things and see that we could have two nations living inside one land as long as we respect each other's right to exist together. Now, the demographic issue, which it's understandable why any population fears becoming a minority. I think one of the reasons why there's a lot of Palestinian trauma is because of the demographic switch that occurred on this land. Also, take into consideration, Jews' very difficult history with anti-Semitism and multiple Holocausts and terror that, we can't expect Jews to give up demographic control willingly, but there are ways to do it that the, Palestinians currently living in the West Bank can have way more say over their local communities, and Jews will have way more say over their local communities, right? It's not just a basic two-state or one-state paradigm. I think we need to break out of that thinking and try to find something more sophisticated that solves the aspirations of both people. I'm just putting out there, right? And this goes by the name of a federation, right? The whole idea is that there's different states within the land, and they have localized control. There's many details that I didn't mention. There's many different form of federation solutions, but if anybody is interested in what I'm saying, look it up. There's a lot of organizations promoting federations. Regular guest Rudy Rushman often promotes it. Dan Kehati from The Home often promotes this idea. Yehuda HaKohen promotes this idea. And if you speak to most Palestinians living here, they want a one-state solution. So I think we should look in this direction. That being said, if one of you two think two states is the way to go, I am happy to hear. I want to make one last point. Moving back to the homes that Palestinians were kicked out of, I mean, we cannot create justice by creating another injustice. We need to accept that nobody will be removed from their homes. No more Palestinians, no more Israelis will be removed from their homes. Let's start from there. So if there's an Israeli living in a home or in a land that was once occupied by Palestinians, you do not create justice by removing them from their home. Instead, perhaps some kind of reparation or compensation of a sort in order to make things right, to heal the pains of the past. But any notion of creating an injustice towards one population in order to create justice for another population, we should just reject that notion outright, because it's going to do nothing to progress change. It's just going to create more of the same violence and hate.
Yeah.
Follow up, but yeah, whoever would like to.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, like, I completely agree with that and with that assessment, and I really do. I am a one-state person, so like whether if it's like a by federation, something like Belgium, or something more on the lines of like the United States, where it's like different states and each one has their own like set like level of autonomy, but they're still connected by this like federal government. I feel like that's something that's very interesting. Like something that might be very interesting to look into. That way, like no one really gets upset about like Palestinians can live in the Palestinian parts and Jews can live in the Jewish parts, and so it's completely like everyone gets what they want, and so I feel like that is something that might be. I just feel like from my position is that I like to argue from points of pragmatism. I just feel like that's the more realistic option of the way things are now. I really think that a two-state solution is not really viable anymore. I really think like you got settlements like Ariel, the size of Brooklyn right now. You know what I mean? They're not like, I don't think people are gonna like like carry it off and just like, okay, we're going to Netanya or something. Like I don't think that's gonna happen. Like, so I feel like some sort of like bi-federation is probably more realistic. And so I would love to work more in like that direction as opposed to, like two separate states and, they can just like work differently. And, so yeah, that's my perspective.
Yeah, I really appreciate you making that point, Adar. And I like that we all found the common ground. Like nobody should be kicked out of their home.
I brought up a comment that just did. Jews have the right to live in Judea and Samaria, and Palestinians have the right to live in Yafo, Haifa, and Jerusalem. So yeah, we're with you, Michael.
I will say this because that was an interesting point, the way you said it, Adar, and I would imagine that Mohammad, you agree that we want a future where Palestinians can travel anywhere and live anywhere, etc., and Israelis vice versa. But I don't want to also assume that is it sounds great, but at the same time, again, I think all this talk about the one-state solution, even the solutions that take into account the concept of two separate societies having their own stuff, I think that does overlook, at least now in the timeline that we're living in, that the war, the resistance against Israel, it's a war, but Palestinians refer to it as resistance, is not really merely just about Israel's actions, and it really never has been. It's about, Israel, and even if there was a federation, there was some, much more power given to Palestinian affairs and things like that. It's never, at least for the radicals, it's the existence of a Jewish collective that has even a modicum of power. And that's what really pisses off the extremists. And so until we have this civil war, I can't think of any other term for it, within Palestinian society, I think, that could be an okay vision, but it just doesn't make any sense at this point. I think once you have that internal, discussion that we all agreed, the internal discussion among the Palestinians hasn't happened. Once that starts to happen and things move forward, then I think there are all sorts of solutions that might open up, right? About freedom of movement and this and that. But ultimately, the occupation as it exists today will not end unless there is a political settlement, right? So the thrust, and this is what I was asking earlier, the nature of the Palestinian cause, it just never takes into account that the occupation cannot be ended unilaterally, right? Morally or according to international law, right? It has to be a bilateral agreement. And so I think, a lot of Israelis want to ease the lives of Palestinians, but they need a partner there. They need someone to step up on a political level. And then once that happens, maybe there are some freedom of movement issues that could be addressed. But I think just a last point also about demographics. It's frustrating to always hear the demographic argument made or marshaled against Israel. And of course, I'm not denying that there is a demographic concern. But I think, imagine if the birth rates were so in favor of the Jews in that land, Palestinians, I feel, would freak out over the demographic concern. Because again, Palestinian society is pretty homogenous. It's 99% Arab Muslim, around there. And I can't imagine that they would be cool with, again, getting rid of their society and just sort of mixing in its entirety just with a very large Jewish minority. Again, these things are not a science totally, right? We don't know, we can't wave a wand, but just based on how Palestinian society exists today, I think demographics are actually more of a concern for them. Because they don't have the power on the ground, of course, doesn't come out,
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I think it's just we more than anything should just acknowledge that not a single population in the history of populations has wanted to become a minority when they were once a majority, right? It's just, it's against our nature, so we should just acknowledge that. And again, don't confuse this for an appeal to nature fallacy. Just because something's natural doesn't mean it's by default okay. But when you want to create political and sociological change, we need to take into consideration how humans are, like what we react to. So it is worth acknowledging that, we do need to take that into consideration. Mo, Daniel brought up a point that, I think it's fair. And I think many Israelis are concerned about, they think that, I think it's over exaggerated. I think many Israelis think the majority of Palestinians are extremists. I think they think like the majority just want to kill all Israelis. I don't think it's the majority. From my experience, it's not the majority, but I think it is a legitimate concern that there is a large enough population that would not agree to any form of Israel, not one state, not two states. And I'm happy to talk about extremism on the side of Israel, but let's first address this. What are your thoughts on that? Do you have any ideas for how we could address that?
Like I said, like this whole thing comes with generations of trauma of people suffering under the hands of like conflict and occupation and so forth. So I really feel like it's hard, but there needs to. I feel for the most part, a lot of the resistance against Israel comes from diaspora Palestinians who feel like they've been either like disconnected from the land and they're trying to find ways to connect back to the land. And so they, get a little more active and, rail against Israel and stuff like that. But like for the most part, for Palestinians on the ground, like I feel like they're so sick of this situation from my perspective. And I like lived a relatively upper class life in Ramallah. But for the most part, it's just that they just want to live their lives and like, fuck, like, like work and like feed their kids and go to school and stuff like that. And usually it's just that the problem is that might induce some people's getting rage is that seeing that, the unemployment is so bad in the area. And every time you walk to go, or every time you drive to go see your friend in Nablus or something, you got to stop by an 18-year-old holding an M16 that's like kind of like giving you a smug look of, yeah, like listen, look at me, look who's in charge. And this is just from me. This is like from my personal experience of me like going back in the summer. I got away with a lot of things because I'm an American and I speak English properly. People get a little more hesitant to like like mess with me basically. But for the most part, for the lives of a Palestinian, I still have a green ID card, a green Hawiyah. And so when these people go around and they're driving their day in day out, is just seeing, just like basically having this military force controlling your day-to-day life. It's really hard for them to try to find a way to be like, oh, maybe they're just like me, they have families too and stuff like that. You're kind of stuck in this mindset where like, your life is just shit nonstop. And I'm sorry for using that language, but like, yeah, your life is just like so bad nonstop. And the only people that you see and the only people that you can like point is like are the soldiers that are walking around holding guns and like telling you, oh, open your trunk. Oh, what do you got? Oh, what's up with this? Why are you holding this? And stuff like that. And so, yeah, someone made a good point about Gaza. The thing is, I'm not really familiar with much of what's happening in Gaza. I know that there's a lot of stuff going on, especially with like the military fights and like, Hamas doing stuff and then Israel like bombing the crap out of it. And so like, I wouldn't really like to talk much about Gaza. Maybe if someone else has more of an experience with it. It's just that I personally don't have. I sympathize with them in the fact that they are where most of the Palestinian refugees come from, and they have dealt with most of like the blunt trauma of being part of engaged in the conflict. But at the same time, I'm not as informed as as a Gaza person would be. So I'd like rather save it for them.
Cool. So, yeah, Daniel, I actually wanted to throw a question over your way regarding what Mo said. First of all, Mo, you apologize for saying shit. You don't need to. We allow cursing on the show.
Thank you.
The only thing we don't allow is hate, unless it's in the comments. But I might start moderating that better because we got some nasty players here today.
Yeah, today is one of those spicy comment sections, huh?
Yeah. I mean, it's just like
I'm consciously staying away. I want to stay in good spirits.
Yeah, exactly. It could only bring you down. So, Mo, you brought up a great point that a lot of the extremism, no one's born an extremist, no one's born a terrorist. We're all products of our environment. So, when we point to extremists, the question is not to. It's not a question, but are the natural inclination is to say they're extremists, that's their problem, they need to be dealt with. But the right question to ask is, how do we change the environment to be an environment in which extremists are not created? So
right.
It seems like if we can change the environment, then we could have much less extremists. So my question to you, Daniel, do you think that you brought up that legitimate concern, but do you think given better living conditions, some amount of reconciliation process, that we could minimize the amount of extremists on both sides? Because we do have a problem with extremism in Israel. Can we reduce the extremists on both sides where we could have a solution?
Yeah, great question. I think better living conditions should always be on the table and should always be the first consideration. Where of course, security is not compromised. I think it goes for any society. And I think Israel has, to a very large extent, made tremendous efforts to do that in very trying circumstances. If you follow like the COGAT, the coordinator, I don't have to tell you, Adar, coordinator for government, activities in the territories. I mean, it's just daily, how they try to improve Palestinian lives. Now, as Mohammad was telling me about this sort of like anecdotal, and he's gone through it, like the checkpoints and all that. This is like the unfortunate, sometimes cold part of hearing those stories as someone who is an Israel supporter and an advocate, that it just feels like when I respond to that, giving the political response, well, maybe that wouldn't happen if XYZ,
Right.
I feel like hollow inside, right? Because I don't want that to be the response, but at the same time, I really don't know any better response. I mean, I could say, I'm like, sorry that you had to experience that. That's horrible. Because, at the end of the day, there are just people going about their lives and they shouldn't have to suffer for the bad apples in their own society. But going back to your point, I mean, but understanding that political aspect, I think, again, going back to my initial point, it's so central, I think. And I know it's hard, but it has to be thought about on the Palestinian side. Completely understand that it's not easy. Because, at the checkpoint, you're not going to expect an 18-year-old Israeli with an Uzi or whatever gun he's holding, to say, you
And
know,
M16.
let's talk. I'm 16, you know, whatever. Let's talk politics. Or, you know, if only your leadership did this, or if only, you know, like,
Right.
you know, you're not going to get that. And also, why would the Palestinian listen to that guy? You know, that's
Right.
why it has to happen internally. And again, very unfortunate, because then you might have this scenario where you have moderates in the Palestinian areas who say, you know, try to make the case to those on the fence, or the extremists who say, look, these are political situations, political problems we can iron out. We can work with the Israelis, and they might want to have a little bit of some assets with them, right? Some sort of like backup to say, well, if we do it, or look how Israel's playing ball with us now. They're giving us this much land for development. They're opening these things up, et cetera. The economy's better. I think the problem is it's a fine line. When you said, Adar, like better living conditions, it's, you know, sometimes that could be a very politicized term as well. Like, should we grant Palestinians more land in Area C, for instance? Is that humanitarian? Is that political, right? There's like a little bit of like a fine line with that. Some Palestinians would say, you know, or supporters would say, yeah, yes. Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
Well,
the bottom line is, I don't think better living conditions would be the thrust of this evolution within Palestinian society. And it's unfortunate, because maybe that would be some cachet that the moderates could use to say, look, we've gotten these benefits. But I think I think there's a lot of history there that counteracts that.
I hear you. And first, I just want to say that, you know, it's, you know, first of all, I commend you for acknowledging that, you know, you don't want to give a hollow response. And you're right that empathy is important to, you know, reconciliation and just healing, you know, the wounds of the past 100 years. So giving a purely political response when someone's talking about their struggle doesn't do much to progress, you know, dialogue and unity between those people. But I do think that there's a lot that Israel does that contributes to the radicalization of the Palestinians that are not absolutely essential to Israeli security. So, and many Israelis are going to disagree with me here, because they support this stuff for political or ideological reasons. But I look at it, it's like what Israel has the right to do. We have a piece of land where we are free and have self-determined on. We have the right to keep ourselves safe, but there's a lot that we do that does aid in the radicalization of the Palestinians that we don't have to. So one, we're continuing to build settlements. The way Palestinians view building of settlements is continued theft of land. And I really don't care much if you say that's not their land, that's our land. Well, in their eyes, it's their land and not your land. And in building, you aid in their radicalization. It creates increased despair. Despair, you know, is what gets people to often act violently and you know, leads to extremism. So what one is building more settlements, but building more settlements, it's not just building settlements that increases military presence. And we have increased military presence. It's more interactions between the Israeli military and the Palestinians. And those interactions are not friendly ones. It's often someone in a place of authority speaking to someone not as an equal. And again, we were talking about innate reaction to things. Well, people have a very negative innate reaction to having authority that they do not see it as their own, right? No population is happy being governed by other people. So again, settlements make them feel like their land's being taken. That increases military presence, which also gives them more bad interactions with Israelis, adds to their oppression. In addition to that, the soldiers that are in the West Bank guarding are not trained well enough to be doing that job. There are many instances of abuse. It's rampant. And again, people deflect and say, yeah, well, anytime you have a war, you're going to have abuse. Yeah, but again, that doesn't make it right. So Israeli soldiers can abuse Palestinians, whether it's being too aggressive with them, whether it's even stealing stuff from them when they do home searches, whether it's humiliating them at checkpoints. Very rarely are Israelis punished for doing this, right? So that's a very obvious policy we can do. We can change the culture and start to discipline soldiers who abuse their power. In addition to that, we could just invest immense resources into into some kind of cross-border dialogue. I know this is challenging because there's a very strong anti-normalization movement amongst Palestinians, but at least the first things, ending settlements and holding soldiers accountable for their abuse, are two things that I think currently cause immense pain to the Palestinians, which we could just, we could end if we decided to.
No, I completely agree with Adar. I feel like that's, yeah.
I would definitely agree on one of your points about holding soldiers accountable for their abuse. And I think there are times where it should go without saying. Sometimes there are things that happen in the field that don't get reported on and don't always make the pages of Haaretz. And we don't, of course there are those that do, and we know about them. We say, look how great, self-policing Israel can be. But of course, I think there's always improvements. I think there's a lot to commend Israel for that, but there's also a lot of improvements. I know Israelis take that very seriously. And you served. I haven't served. So I mean, the Israelis I've spoken to, and I know very personally, they take a lot of pride in trying to do the best job they can in impossible circumstances. I want to address a couple of things. I don't want to get caught up with terminology, but even the term oppression, mm-hmm. I very strongly disagree that what Israel's doing is oppression. And I know you kind of made the case earlier that things are needlessly hard on Palestinians, and I think that would serve a definition of oppression, right? If there's a needlessness to hardship. I disagree. I think there are individual cases, but I think that's also loaded language, and I don't know. I know we want to connect with Palestinians at the same time. I think that is very loaded and I think untrue to a large extent, because I think intentions matter when it comes to oppression. So yes, there are feelings like I could feel oppressed, but at the same time, I think intentions and.
So I'm partially with you here. I definitely agree it's a loaded term and it does trigger many people. But is the intention ever oppression? It's normally like it's a result of something else, right? It's.
Yeah, I was gonna say so. Yeah, go ahead, Danielle, if you want to finish your thought.
I think there could be, like just to play around with that. I think there could be policies that an entity never intentioned that happen to adversely affect the population unnecessarily. And I think if they stop that, then I guess, the oppression ends. I do think intent is a large part of it. Of course, I do think Palestinians experience hardship. And we could always go down the list of things that Israel may or may not be able to do better. But ultimately, why people are so against that term is because, you have one player to this conflict that basically leverages the Palestinian population to their political advantage, right? Like, so resistance, right? The militant resistance definitely takes into account that the response will be borne by regular Palestinians. And this, unfortunately, is a very dark, cold calculus that they've made over the last few decades. So I think that does factor into whether I think these hardships are a product of oppression. Not to say that there can't be individual circumstances that might warrant better treatment, but I think there's a bigger dynamic at play than just simply saying what Israel's doing is oppression.
I understand what you're trying to say, Danielle, but at the same time, I feel like it's just baked into the situation where you have one ethnic group policing and monitoring another ethnic group. And at the same time, like if I'm going to, like, this happened to me actually last summer, where I was going to I was visiting my friend in Nablus, and we were driving back. And they stopped me and three of my friends. You can imagine the picture. It's 4 guys driving at 2 a.m. in the morning. All of us got like beards and stuff driving at the a.m. And we got stopped in front of the settlement of Shiloh. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that one. And we got held up, and I was the one driving. Ended up being pulled out of the car. They were saying, okay, like patting me down and stuff. And I could see that they were very serious about their job. They wanted to make sure that I wasn't doing anything, like I didn't have anything and stuff like that. But at the same time, I don't see, like, I can hardly picture me. I'm there for the summer. I'm there for break. They can pat me down, whatever. I'm going to New York after this. I don't give a fuck. But someone that's living there, and they have to experience that the whole time, built over the fact that they can't get a job, they can't do anything, and they're stuck over here. Their family is going through hardship, and they're just sitting there, like, they're not going to go there and be like, oh, they're not going to sit there and like, oh yeah, this is part of some greater political dynamic that's hard to address right now, and one day we'll find peace and stuff. Like, at that moment, they're like, fuck, this guy, he thinks he's better than me because he has a gun and he's my land, basically. You know what I mean? And so it's hard. It's a hard thing. And the thing is, like, if you can look at like even like things that they teach you in undergrad, like, you know, the Stanford prison experiment, the fact that you just give people like the illusion of authority, and then they just start like running around saying like, yes, like I'm the arbitrator of justice in this area. I will teach them. I'll bring justice and make sure keep everybody safe and stuff. And so just by the merit of having like all this power put on you, especially when you're a young dude, like if you're an 18-year-old kid, I would probably behave exactly the same way. You know, you're gonna go on. You're bound to go on some power trip that's gonna get somebody hurt in the end.
Right. That's an interesting point. I could empathize with you on that totally. There's no good response to that. I just wanted to just say something about the settlements, because I agree, Adar, that there are things that Israel does that do go beyond security, and I'm actually tired of that argument that's sometimes made that everything Israel does in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank is security, right? Because that's not true. It's not true. And you know, but some of it is also not simply just to, you know, bust the collective chops of Palestinians. I mean, there's two ways I look at it. One is you have to factor in how Israel now sees, after 3 decades, Palestinian the movement, right? And again, that fine line between, you know, there are lands in the West Bank that we might say, like, you know, are Israeli, Palestinian, but, you know, Israel doesn't see this anymore as, you know, playing the two-state game has cost Israel dearly, right? In blood and just in diplomacy and their rights. And so I see a lot of this as Israel reasserting their rights. And again, I'm not talking about every last little bit of land that's taken by Israel, right? But it is a question also of rights. As long as they don't kick out Palestinians from those lands, and if those lands are vacant, and again, the overall percentage of settlement area is very small. I get that where they are, some of them makes, you know, you said there's a military presence that comes along, right? But I do see settlement serving as a pressure tactic and sort of Israel's way of saying, we're not going to play this, you know, we're tired of your war. And there's been proof too that when Israel settlements have brought the Palestinians to the table. I mean, there's this famous line by the Palestinian mayor of Bethlehem at the start of the Madrid peace conference in '91, where he told a WAPO reporter, he said, you know, they asked him, what do you think of the settlements? And he's like, well, settlements are the reason we're here. We realize that Israel can just build anywhere with impunity. We have nothing, we can't do anything about it. And the only thing we can do is actually negotiate our way out of this. And of course, that led to Oslo, which was a big, you know, was fake. But at the same time, there was a real impetus, right? There was a real pressure that was put to bear. And again, I just have to return to the politics. I think once the politics can start to reform, these quality of life issues will completely go away. I mean, not completely. There's always going to be radicals, right? There's always going to be attacks.
Absolutely. But like the reason why I brought that up, and just like my experience, like I'm telling you, my experience is virtually nothing negligible to what other Palestinians go through throughout their lives. It's just that, like, so next time you see a Palestinian like so filled with, I guess, passion or rage against Israel and like the settlement in Israel, at least like people would have an understanding of where they're coming from. And it's not just like, oh man, like these guys must really hate Jews, you know, like they just like have nothing else better to do in their life. You know, it's like there's something more ingrained and sad, like permeating through the hearts and minds of people. Like most of the go ahead.
No, I think those experiences can exist on their own and breathe on their own and cause despair and rage. And I think oftentimes they also those experiences unfortunately add to a pre-existing, you know, ethos within Palestinian society. Again, I'm not Palestinian. I don't live there. You know, I get the usual Palestinian media watch emails and all that, and I can research all that stuff. But a lot of it is true. And you know, again, I don't know how much it permeates society, but there is a large culture of resistance. I would say most Palestinian youth do not want to do that. They don't want to throw their lives away. But there is a significant number that take pride in that. And that's a problem. And I think those experiences validate what they hear among their elders. And that's a serious problem. I mean, you're right. There's a human element to this, right? No one's born to hate.
Right. And you know, the younger Palestinians support resistance at a higher rate than the older Palestinians, which again leads me to believe that it does have something to do with increased despair. And, you know, recent polling showed that only 7% of Palestinians think peace will be attained within the next 100 years, something crazy like that, right? 7%. So
You don't think that's an increase in social media in the last decade or so, and the Palestinian exposure to their radical messaging? I think that has a lot to do with the peace process, and not to say everything was honky-dory before Oslo, but there was a lot more interaction. And
yeah, no, I'd say that's a good point, that social media might play into that as well. But it's not hard to see why, the more checkpoints you need to wait at to get to school, the more bad interactions you have with Israelis are just going to lead you to view, Israel in a certain way and think that the only solution, is through resistance and not dialogue. But you're right. We probably cannot attribute the radicalization to just one thing, and we often try to attribute to what we want it to be to strengthen our argument. But I'm with you on that. That would be an interesting conversation to have. So we are going on an hour and a half now. I do want to take it to questions. So guests, if you have any questions, not guests, chat. If you have any questions, let's hear them. And again, if you like our guests, which I like very much, I think this was actually one of the most productive and insightful conversations we've had. There's a few points were made that I need to reflect on myself deeply in order to better understand them. So if you want to get in touch with them, their contact information is in the description. And guys, I want to point Daniel and Mo, testament to you guys doing a great job is that we have 23 upvotes, 2 downvotes. That's a pretty damn good ratio for the most controversial topic potentially in the history of existence, right? So excellent work. I'm going to give a shout out to Ian Lev. He's a regular guest who has an obsession with, why'd it cut off? He goes, are either of these two vegans? Ian hates vegans. Somehow he brings anti-veganism into every discussion I've ever been with him, which is kind of funny because all a vegan is saying, let's harm less animals. I mean, not such a radical position if you think about it. Let's see, questions coming in. I saw one earlier. And guys, thank you all so much for coming. Just know, our after party is in the Discord channel. If you want to get invited to the Discord, go to Patreon, link in description, and you can get invited to Discord. This is from, I'm trying to see, I'm assuming this is Michael. I don't know why, it's just the double L makes me think it's not Michael, and it's Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but Michael Rosenthal, thank you. Do Daniel or Mohammad have any ideas of policies that can make the situation better for both populations? So we touched on this briefly, and I do want, let's do 1 minute responses just because I wanna get to some more.
Go ahead.
Specific policy decisions. I feel like for the most part, recently. I don't know if Israel did it just to spite the PA or something, but they allowed a lot of Palestinians to go cross the border without the permission slips, or not permission slips. It's we call them tasarih. I don't know what they're called in English.
In Hebrew, I don't know the English.
Day passes, something like
something, yeah, whatever. It's like the day passes, and they just I don't know if it's just to spite the PA, say look, we don't need you. You can just go. We'll just let them go through this little hole in the fence or something. And so they just ended up going, and people came back, and I don't know. In my mind, I thought it was just trying to the way the Israeli government can test the waters and see how things would be, and maybe it's it won't be such a horrible thing to let Palestinians move freely. And so it's I feel like that was an interesting thing that they did. I just feel I'm telling you, I lived 9 years in Ramallah. The only Israelis I've seen were were soldiers. I don't know any. I didn't know where the hero. I only saw people with the green helmets walking around between the entrance of the what is it, Road 60? Route 60. Those are the only people I've seen. So I didn't actually meet Jews until I came to New York, and then I'm look, they're actually human just like me. And so I feel more of interaction between more different peoples would probably be permit. Yeah, thank you. That's what it's called. It's a permit. And so having that sort of interaction, more interaction would probably lessen, because you can tell even from Arabs that the Arabs that seem to be the most chill with Israelis are the ones that work settlements or work inside Israel. And I feel that is not from nothing. It's because they're like, oh, okay, they're just people too, you know. And like same thing with Israelis. They'll see a Palestinian, and they'll think like, oh, like this person has a mom and a dad that they really love and care about. So do I. Maybe we can like work something out, and you know. And so like I don't know. I feel like that's just like small things that someone can do. Big policies, I don't know. It's not my field. Like I'm going to be an elementary school teacher. I'm not so sure about those big like policy proposals. But maybe Daniel could help you answer that.
Yeah, there's no silver bullet with the maybe that's the wrong metaphor. For policy proposals, I've already expressed that less friction will come from less resistance, less militant resistance, which also includes, popular resistance as it's coined, which can include, nonviolent protests. But even some of those are really about, creating friction and documenting supposed Israeli heavy-handed responses. And I think some of those things are ultimately need to be reversed. The concept of resistance, I think, even if it's purely just resisting the occupation, which I think is rare because it's really ultimately more fundamental about resisting Israel. I think those are actually detrimental because I think they're negative interactions. I agree with you. I think there should be more positive interactions. I think there should be Palestinians going into Israel and working in Israeli areas in Judea Samaria. And I think that happens a lot. Like Rami Levy, the supermarket chain that's talked about a bunch as like this model of cooperation. You have a lot of Arabs working there and they're not alone. I think Israel's presence in the territories has had positive interactions too. Of course, there's negative as well. But I think that is a huge part of this. So I agree with you on that. I do think, I'm just going back to that point, what's going to affect policy ultimately is Palestinian society changing. And I think once Palestinian society starts to change, you're going to see that's the real power. I think they have a power for peace that they're not leveraging. And I don't think they're close to leveraging, but you'll see Israel is would be easily moved by Palestinian, a conversation that they would have about this, right? Like they already follow what they say to each other all the time, right? Palestinians see what Israelis say, vice versa. If that happens, I think you would see some major shift in how benevolent Israel could be in terms of the political level and withdrawing and things like that. Even things that are pre-developing a possible state, right? I think Israel has shown that it is moved by its own people. And once Israeli people see that Palestinians are having this conversation, that would be ultimately beneficial.
So Daniel, a little follow-up. Don't you? I think my concern with that is, it's setting a very high barrier to entry to say, if Palestinian society changes, then it will solve everything. But in order for society to change, you say that to an individual, they're like, okay, I can't change my society. I could maybe change myself, but it's like it's not a message that gives people like in understanding of what exactly they need to do. And it's like, yeah, right, exactly. And our culture is often a result of our environment. So it's like, and again, I often talk about societal change. So I am with you to an extent because me as an individual, I want to impact society, but it seems like policy is like a top-down approach. Society is a bottom-up approach. So I feel like we need to take it from both. But I think that,
politics is local, right? I mean, politics is global, they say, but it's also local. And I don't want to interrupt you, but I just think that it would be thinking outside the box. I don't think it's thinking outside the box to say that, Palestinian civil society could start to develop NGOs and other organizations that could push back a little bit on some of the rejection. And I think that's definitely not an overnight thing. And it's going to be dangerous, but I think there's no other choice. I think that's the only option for them to move forward. But
yeah, I just wanted to say like one thing like really quickly is that also like you might also need to take into consideration of like how it looks from my position, like me going to as a Palestinian to another Palestinian and say like, you know what really the solution to the problem is? We just got to stop, just kind of don't do anything about it, just chill out, and just go to school, forget about it. That's not what the problem is not what it implies physically. It's what it implies psychologically. It's just saying like, oh, just capitulate, just bend the knee, accept defeat. You're a loser. Now these are like, so it's not a good look for like, it's not a good look that Palestinians want to like take or even want to like like propose to other Palestinians, just say like, oh, this whole like all this fighting that you guys been doing, it's all for naught. Like it's nothing. Like it's worthless. Don't just like completely stop, sit down, go home. That's why the thing is, it's like there needs to be like a much greater reconciliation. But honestly, it's a long discussion. We can probably talk about this for like 5 hours, maybe. Yeah.
That was a huge point. I'm not going to talk about it, but what you just said is, what is all this, all the fighting we've done for decades, what has it been for? And I think that's the biggest obstacle, right? Like, has this
right.
Have we kept our children in refugee camps for decades, all for naught? Like, it seems like, how would that, how would you move?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Agreed.
I'll add some policy changes that I think can make a difference, and some of them may take a generation. And what I'm going to say is relevant mostly to both sides. I'm going to speak as if I'm speaking to Israelis, okay? Teach Israelis Arabic in school from the time they're young. Every Israeli should know Arabic, Palestinian Arabic. We need to know how to communicate with their neighbors. Teach Israelis Palestinian history, teach them about the Nakba, teach them about the Palestinian struggle, and have our Zionist teachings, our narrative, our Jewish narrative needs to encompass the Palestinian narrative. We need to find a way to step out of this two conflicting narratives. And I think if we teach children from a young age that, look, our history is complex, a lot of bad things happen to one another, but this is a unified narrative that really understands both people, I think that will create a population that is much more empathetic and understanding of the other side, which gets the ground ready for peace to be made, right? It seems like many solutions can't even be solved because there's so much distrust between both populations. The other one I would say, I think, soldiers do need to be held accountable for their actions. If you look at military conduct, like what they teach you, they tell you that abuse is unacceptable. But the reality on the ground is that, when abuse occurs, people turn a blind eye. And this isn't only from the 18-year-old soldiers, it's also from the commanders as well. I've seen it with my own two eyes. Many of my friends share the same stories.
Right.
And again, but just to make it clear, it's nowhere near as bad as what some Palestinian media outlets make it seem like. It's not like we're going into homes and killing babies, right? There's that obvious over-exaggeration. That's not what's happening. But there's way more abuse way more abuse is happening than should happen, and it needs to be addressed.
No, I completely agree. Yeah.
Those are two areas of policy that I think should probably change. Do I have any more? No, yeah.
By the way, yes, learning Arabic, it seems so basic, but you're right. It's like that's not a solution I've heard really commonly. I think it's so basic and beautiful. It's speak the same language. Absolutely.
I tried my best, like for the last year. I tried for a mistake. I tried learning Hebrew, and I still do. Like anyway, the berkat, but like still, like I'm like, like I learned Hebrew for nothing. I'm like, oh, it's so similar to Arabic and all this stuff, and it's like super nice. And I felt like it really like helped me. So like now next time, like usually instead of soldiers trying to talk to me in like broken English, I can talk to them in broken Hebrew. And so like I feel like it gives them a sort of more leniency, saying, oh, this guy, look, he's Arab, he's trying to learn the language. I always used to crack the same joke and saying that like, oh, New York is the land of Israel, Mispar Shtaim, it's the land of Israel part 2. And then, I get a couple chuckles from here and there. And, from then on, you can see that they're like, there's something that goes on saying, oh, like, look at this guy, he's nice. And like, and so like, that's like how I try to do my part. But there's like, someone keeps on asking this question in the chat. They're asking me if I like identify as a Canaanite or a Phoenician or something.
Yeah, let me bring that up. I just want to make one comment because Jordan Walter, who is also a regular guest and a Patreon supporter. Jordan, I'm going to send you the Discord link after this. I know you haven't gotten it yet. I'm going to send it. Thank you for joining almost every week. Israel and Palestine should legalize weed.
True.
You know what? Both sides can mellow out a little bit.
From the sake of being able to mellow out, but just liberty perspective, a country that tells you what you can and can't smoke, it's like, shut up and deal with other stuff. Don't tell us what we could do. We're not hard to do. And very rarely does someone get high and start fighting with people. You know, you don't get high and go out and start fighting. Alcohol does that, not weed. So I'm with you. We're with you. I think that's one of the greatest areas of consensus here. Let's bring up that Canaanite question. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Hold up. If anybody wants to intern for the Great Debate, I'm always looking for more interns. And one of the tasks I need for the interns is to manage the comment section. Damn, where's that Canaanite question?
Can we leave those poor Canaanites alone? Jeez.
Okay, so I'll try to repeat the question. You know, they were asking is what do you view as Palestinian identity? Is it Canaanite? Is it Phoenician? Is it Arab?
Yeah, I feel like that question comes up a lot, and I really, like from the bottom of my heart, I really think it's a really weird question because it's always trying to get a leg up over one another, saying like, oh, so Jews claim descendants from the Hasmonean kingdom. Well, actually, I'm a Canaanite that traces my back farther back than that, and so it's just weird. Like, do like Palestinians have Canaanite ancestry? Yeah, probably for the most part. Like, you can tell just from like physical appearances. Like, I don't really look like a person that's from Yemen, or I really don't look like a person that's from Saudi Arabia or stuff. And maybe there's some admixture, but just identifying for the most part as Palestinians exist today, we identify as Arabs, regardless of what that means. Like, doesn't mean that we came from Arabia, doesn't mean that we just speak Arabic, like all this sort of like connotation. I identify as a Palestinian Arab. I don't really care about these old ethnic groups that don't exist anymore. I know a lot of like Lebanese people like try to identify as Phoenicians to kind of separate themselves from this Arab identity because they see it as something like something bad or something. And I think, honestly, I just think it's just like a sort of self-hatred. It's just like, there's nothing wrong with being Arab. You can be Arab and like be Palestinian or have like any sort of identity that you belong to. So yeah, like I just wanted to address that. I feel like trying to like trace your lineage back to some old ancient people, like that doesn't really exist. We don't even know what they ate, what they believed in, what they used to do for fun. Just trying to like hit your tent to that where it kind of seems like a safe bet because they don't got Canaanites. They're cool. They don't. Nothing's happening with them. They're just they live in the past. They did their thing and now they're gone. I just think it's just a scapegoat to like avoid the problems now.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think the whole conversation of we were here first, it kind of comes like this. It's like, Jews return and say, we were here 2,000 years ago, we were here first, which I think might be relevant for conversation, but it doesn't justify injustices, right? So it's not like we get to kick people out of their land because we were here first. So yeah. It's almost like there's this like race for who was here first. So then, as you mentioned, Palestinians say, no, we were Canaanites. We were here even before the Jews. And, we could argue over indigeneity and who was here first forever. And there might be certain circles where it's a relevant conversation, but okay, I actually don't care who was here first. What I care about is that we're both living here on the same land. Yeah. We need to make it work. Here now. That's what's important. Coming here first or whatever your history is doesn't grant you more rights. What should grant you your rights is that you're a human being, and we should work from that premise. A human being living on a land, right? Doesn't matter your ethnicity. You should have the same rights. So I don't even see it so much of a relevant conversation. For historical purposes, it may be interesting.
I think a lot of that conversation is fueled by, and this is where there's a little imbalance. Of course, you're going to find Zionists who say, all the Arabs came from somewhere else and there were no Arabs living there, all that. Of course, I think that's a very minority view.
Every single one of us came from Saudi Arabia. Every single one of us.
Straw man argument out of that. I mean, they might say most or right. They. Yeah. I've heard it all. Sure. We could talk about migrations and all that till tomorrow, but I think you're right. I think it's fueled by a little bit of a defensiveness and an understandable defensiveness because Israel is called illegitimate. It's been called illegitimate for a while. It's been called European. So of course there is a bit of a race, as you said, just to reassert that no, we're not. We actually go back. It's like it's sort of maybe a little bit of an overcorrect. This whole thing where you're like, no, we came before you. But
right.
Truth and all that, but I do think it's a response to that sort of denial.
Yeah, it's like me like just saying like if like I go back to some mountain in Kenya and say like, oh, my ancestors came from over here, so This is mine. I'm actually identified as
I don't think that's an apt comparison, because I mean that it's we all came from the Great Rift Valley, in Africa, going back far enough. But I think Jewish identity and our whole being really came from that land, and it's just inexorably tied.
No, absolutely, I absolutely understand like the Jewish connection to the land and that sort of thing. But it's just that like I just feel like the argument of saying like, oh, someone that kind of relates to me back in the day, sort of like like that like lived there at some point, so therefore I have some sort of connection to it. I think that's like a weird argument to make, like depending on like how long. It's a very complicated issue. Like I understand that, but at the same time, it's just that like I feel like we should look at things as how they are now. And the fact is, Jews, Palestinians, Arabs, Samaritans, Druze live over in the land right now. And so how do we deal with that? We're not like Adar used to say a lot, like you're not gonna convince anybody that like actually I have a special connection to this land that's way different than yours, And so like you got to work around like what's happening now and like kind of avoid all that like mumbo jumbo from the past.
I want to pull up one last thing. And Nardine, thank you. You've been here since the beginning. This was a sham debate. I didn't hear a debate. So the reason I call this a debate is because if I didn't call it a debate, less people would click and watch. Yeah, I'm giving up my secret to get clicks because people like watching other people fight. I personally see no reason to do content, at least for me, my own personal content, if it's not going to be productive. And I think there's enough people fighting on social media with nothing resolved. That's not what I want to be doing on this channel. So the reason it's not a debate, it's a great debate. And what makes this debate great is that it's not two sides fighting with one another. It's two sides coming together to find common ground. So I'm sorry my tricky wording led you here.
This was pretty debatey to me. I mean, not debate doesn't have to be negative. I mean, it could just be.
Yeah, we don't have to be at each other's necks and like scream at each other, like
Right, exactly. It is a productive flow of ideas where all sides respect one another. I think Nardine, maybe I'm mistaken, and I am happy you're here. I know I was maybe I came off a little harsh, but I hope you return because these are the productive conversations. This is part of solving the conflict. It's not about those taglines that journalists and politicians make. It's not about owning the other side. That doesn't, we have that everywhere. That does nothing. This is a different platform. We're here to find common ground. We're here to learn new things. So I hope you come back. But if not, best of luck to you wherever you venture to, my friend. Let's see. Do we want to do anything else? No, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, final words for the guests. Anything you'd like to leave us with? The floor is yours.
Yeah, I'll say this was a very profound experience for me. I think about this issue a lot. The amount of times I actually type out the word Palestinian is like astronomical. But then thinking about it, I actually don't speak to many Palestinians. It's just weird. So I sometimes I have to humble myself, right? Like a lot of what I'm going on is just research, right? And looking into things on my own. And it's always, I think it's just so helpful to talk to actual Palestinians and find out their thoughts. And yeah, we can predict, I could have predicted some of the things that I heard today. At the same time, there were some new things. And it's just great to put a human being behind some of these ideas. And it really does humanize the situation. And I'm humbled by that. I hope we can continue the dialogue. I really do think these dialogues matter. I think, people power. We're all talking about, the power of the people now and what we can do to affect change. I just totally think that, we can transform the politics today. Again, I hate to use that P word, the politics, but I do think that ultimately does affect things on the ground. And that's, it's power. Politics is power. And I think power to the people is ultimately us taking the reins from the failed policies of the past. And I think through the people, the policies will ultimately change. And I think we will have peace one day, hopefully. So I really appreciate your time, Mohammad and Adar. Thank you so much for setting this up. and for what
Thank you.
Amen, brother. It was a pleasure. I put a
Yeah.
quote at the bottom of the screen that I think just kind of sums up what we're trying to do. Mohammad.
Yes. Okay. So I'm glad that you have me on. I'm not gonna lie to you. A lot of people that I talked to before going on didn't want me to go on. They thought this was a very bad move and thought this was normalization and all this sort of stuff, negative connotations. But I felt like I feel like it's important to just like have my experience put out there, just my like sort of thought process. I'm by no means an expert of any of the conflict. I'm for more or less a political hobbyist or a person that had influence, was born there and lived through some parts of like the Palestinian experience. So I felt like it was my duty to just like share my experience out there. Whoever wants to listen, they can listen to it. And I really appreciate, even though we probably, me and Danielle still disagree on a lot of things, I still appreciate that we can still have a conversation like this without being too having so much animosity between us. And I think this is a good movement for like trying to bring like people together and trying to have these discussions talked about, because if Palestinians only talk to Palestinians and Israelis only talk to Israelis, no one will get to learn what the other person thinks, and you're just sitting there in your room, like in your echo chamber, not really like advancing or changing your opinions on anything, because no one's challenged you on anything. So yeah, I really appreciate you, Adar and Danielle, for having me.
Thank you both, Brother Daniel, Brother Mohammad.
Can I just get a quick word in on the organizations that I.
Oh yeah. Shout out. Yeah, sure.
Shout out to Fuel for Truth. It's one of two amazing organizations I work for. Fuel for Truth is organized, or it's geared towards young professionals. And we have what's called a boot camp program, which is in LA, New York, other cities around the country, where we offer in-depth education on Israel and the conflict and how to navigate those conversations. Second organization is called Club Z. It's a Zionism for Teens. It's an organization that's geared towards mostly high school students. And through our institute, which is in New York, the Bay Area, LA, Charlotte, we educate Jewish teens on their heritage, on Zionism, Israel, the conflict. And I'll just say, with teens facing anti-Zionist hate, not just on campus, but even increasingly in high school, it's scary out there. And we do equip our teens with the knowledge and the confidence and the pride that they need to understand their history and also to push back on some of that and have productive dialogues like this. So, again, I really appreciate the forum you provide. And it's never like a piece of cake. It's always going to be something that you don't agree with, but I think that's what makes it worthwhile.
I'm with you. Thank you guys so much, and I'd love to have you both on. To those joining us, thank you, chat. It's been a lively one, and if you want, join us in the after party in the Discord channel. From Tel Aviv, Israel. Peace.
Thank you, Mohammad.